Welcome to The Wilderness and the Well. I'm Cece Henderson, your host and founder of the Sanctuary International. Here we talk about aligning with purpose and navigating the seasons of life with God. If you're walking through the wilderness, know this: God always provides wells of refreshing along the way. Today we're talking about those moments when the wilderness gets hard. Uncertainty overwhelms us and we start looking back at what we've left behind. Jobs, relationships, mindsets, even sin. And suddenly Egypt starts looking good again. Let's take some time to talk about when Egypt looks tempting. So let's start by agreeing what we're talking about when we talk about Egypt. When we talk about when Egypt is tempting. And I want to start by reading the scripture for you. It's from Exodus 16 verse 3. And I'm reading it in the Message version. And it says this: "The whole company of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron there in the wilderness. The Israelites said, 'Why didn't God just let us die in comfort in Egypt, where we had lamb stew and all the bread we could eat? You've brought us out into this wilderness to starve us to death, the whole company of Israel.'" So picture the scene. The people of Israel have been enslaved for hundreds of years by the Egyptians, and God raises up Moses to come in front of Pharaoh to say, "Let my people go." Many of us may have watched the movie, The 10 Commandments. I might be showing my age there, but many of us know this story where God releases 10 plagues against Egypt to cause eventually for Pharaoh to agree to let God's people go. And so after this miraculous moment, the Israelites are now moving through the wilderness and they're heading to the promised land. But we hear here about the Israelites starting to question why God brought them to this place, into this wilderness. And in Numbers 11, we start to see this a little bit even more as to what was going on. It says, Numbers 11, starting at verse 4, it says, "Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving, and the people of Israel also wept again and said, 'Oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at.'" When we talk about Egypt, it's often symbolic of bondage, familiarity, and comfort, even when dysfunctional. And here we see in the Bible the Israelites longing to go back to the comfort despite the deliverance, the great deliverance that they've experienced. So what can this look like in modern life? It's things like us returning to burnout-inducing jobs because they feel secure, or reconnecting with those toxic relationships for the comfort, or reverting to self-reliance instead of trusting God. So why do we end up here? Why does Egypt seem so tempting at times? Well, the wilderness is hard. It's a place of testing. It's a place of transition and spiritual formation. It's a place where you can feel lonely, where you can feel afraid. And my personal least favorite, uncertainty. In this space of wilderness, things just seem unsure. You know, that scripture I read to you from Numbers, I find it so interesting. They're listing all of the food that they used to enjoy back in Egypt, and they're tired of the manna. Manna was bread that literally came from heaven each morning. And when they would come out in the morning, God will have provided what they needed for the day. But there were a few things to note about this manna. And I believe that I'm talking to someone here when I say this, because the manna was only for the day. When the Israelites tried to store manna for the next day, they would find that it didn't last. God was teaching them something in this wilderness. We say in the Lord's Prayer, give us our day, our daily bread. And that's literally what the Israelites were experiencing here. They were having to depend on God for their daily provision. And with that came uncertainty. You see, the wilderness is hard and it's an interesting place because on one hand, we experience the miracle of manna. We experience the miracle of God coming in and stepping in and providing just what we need at just the right time. But with that comes uncertainty, and with that comes dependency. And it's this discomfort that can cause us to start to look back at Egypt with longing. It can even distort our memory of Egypt. Because remember, these guys were in slavery, right? They were being burdened and beaten and forced to make their own bricks to build the buildings for the Egyptians. And somehow that memory has faded, and all they're remembering is the abundance of foods that were available. And it's distorted the memory to the point that they don't even remember the suffering. I've been here before, a time when I was tempted back. Earlier in my life, I was a teacher. I used to teach in high school in the UK. And after a short while of teaching in the classroom, I decided I wanted a change and I left the school that I was teaching in. And I looked into changing my career, but I landed in a school that initially was just the dream. I felt purposeful. I felt like I was placed here for a reason. I loved my students. And it was a great 4 years of pouring into this new school, pouring into this space where I felt like I was learning and growing and having an impact. But then things changed. The sense of purpose changed, and it became clear that it was time for me to move on. But this was where fear kicked in, because I decided rather than moving forward to go back. And I went back to the school that I had left. The school that after a short while, or within 1 year of working there, I had said I wanted to leave the profession altogether. But because some of the things that had happened recently in my workplace, I'd forgotten all of that. And I returned back to that school. Well, within 6 weeks, I was crying each day that I drove to that workplace, feeling despondent, feeling depressed, feeling out of alignment. And that always sits as a memory of how sometimes the memory of where we came from can be distorted. And when we go back, we realize it's a huge mistake. So how can we recognize when we're actually being tempted to go back? What are the signs that we might be looking back? Well, number one is romanticizing the past. Looking back at the past through rose-tinted glasses, where we start to think of everything as being perfect. We forget how unhealthy that relationship was. We forget how hard it was to heal from the things that we experienced there. Where we forget the very reasons why we decided to close that season. And we just remember the good times. Maybe even rewrite some of the bad times into good times. That can be a sign that we might be looking back, where we've forgotten why we started this journey away from that into this wilderness. Another common sign that we might be looking back is actually resisting forward movement, just not moving forward towards what it is that we should have been aiming for. And this can look quite literal, where we are not doing things, but one of the classics is where we can be in self-sabotage. You know, that situation where you just don't get your act together, where you do things that means you can't move forward, or you convince yourself that it's not possible. Could be a sign that you're starting to think about going back to Egypt. And the third thing we can do is justifying our old patterns. It's not uncommon for us to sometimes fall back into old patterns, especially when that wilderness feels tough. It's not uncommon for us to want to reach back for the things that used to give us comfort. But it's when we are actually starting to justify it, perhaps starting to explain why it's necessary for us to have to go back. It's a sign that we're starting to be tempted to go back to Egypt. And it's in this space that we need to stop and pause and ask some questions to reflect. What am I afraid to trust God with? As I said, fear is a very real emotion that we experience in the wilderness. And sometimes it's going to be us taking the time to ask, what am I afraid to trust God with? That helps us to reveal what the real issue is and where the real work needs to be done. And another question in the wilderness is this about comfort or calling? Is it about going back to what you think was comfortable? Or is it about moving forward for what you were called to? And that leads to another really important point, is that when God delivers us from Egypt and puts us into the wilderness, He's actually leading us somewhere. God didn't take the Israelites out and just put them into the wilderness without a destination. He was leading them to a promised land. And I want to remind you that if you are in the midst of a wilderness, to remember that this is part of the process of Him leading you somewhere. I want to encourage you to keep going. I want to encourage you to remember that as painful and as difficult as this time may seem, you are actually growing, you're learning, and you're deepening your relationship with God. And I want to give you some practical ways to re-anchor yourself in this time. Because one thing I've said before is that we all know you can feel so anchorless when you're in the midst of a wilderness. And that's really where Egypt can just look so good, because you could just know how to slot back in. It might have been uncomfortable, may have even have been traumatic, but at least you knew how to get through, right? This is where prayer and scripture is going to be so important. I often encourage my clients to build what I call a survival kit. This is collecting scriptures that encourage you, that remind you as to why you are pursuing the journey that you're pursuing. You can add in there worship tunes and songs that can also help you to remember why you are moving forward, to help you to remember who God is and who this God is that you've chosen to trust. Another practical way to navigate this space is community support. I think in a few episodes I'm going to talk about community and finding your community when you're in the wilderness. You're not meant to do it all alone. And by surrounding yourself by the correct type of people, they can really help you. They can really encourage you. And sometimes they can be that voice that tells you, girl, it really wasn't all that in Egypt. Don't go back. And thirdly, taking the time to remember your why. Why did you even step out? You know, in the episode where I spoke with my friend Conjay and we talked about the pioneer wilderness, we talked about where sometimes you're in a wilderness because you chose to be there. You chose to step out and respond to a call. And remembering why you're even there can help. Part of that remembering is going to remind you what was going on in Egypt and why it was not the right place for you. I want to encourage you to take the time to reflect on the journey that you are going through. I want to encourage you to take the time to consider, what does Egypt represent in your life right now? And what would it look like to trust God in the promised land instead? I know it's not easy. I know it's hard. I know that right now Egypt can be looking really good to some of you. But God has something better in store for you. There is a reason why He called you out into the wilderness. There is a reason why He has taken you to walk through this space. He wants to grow you. He wants to transition you. He wants to form more of Him in you. And so this is just a short episode to remind you that when Egypt looks tempting, it's time to tap into your support systems. It's time to remember why you took the step that you did. It's time for you to dip into your toolkit, pull out those worship songs, pull out those scriptures, call on those prayer partners who are going to keep you lifted up. It's time to remember that you are heading to a promised land. Isaiah 43 verses 18 and 19 says, "Remember not the former things, nor consider the things of old. Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert." As you navigate this space, as you navigate all that the wilderness brings with it, I want to remind you that Egypt is not as you remember it. And the things that you're learning in the wilderness, things like learning to depend on His manna, things like learning that God will come through time and time again, are the very things that are going to establish you and strengthen you in the promised land. Don't give up. Don't go back. Look for the wells that He's placed in this wilderness to sustain you. Because remember, in every wilderness there is a well. Let's find it together.